Hey, Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, Calan. Thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into what you are doing. So tell us, let's start off with a little bit more about what Christopher Street Tours is. Tell us a little bit more about it.
So, Christopher Street Tours is an LGBTQ walking tour company that offers LGBTQ walking tours and experiences. We started in 2018, just me, kind of a passion project, a side hustle, and it started just as queer walking tours in the village. But as time sort of evolved, I realized people are really looking for a walking tour, but also for much more. So we started offering some other experiences, meetings with LGBTQ activists. I started doing speaking engagements. So it's really sort of like anything LGBTQ related around history and activism is where Christopher Street Tours comes in, both in New York City and beyond.
Okay, so it's not just New York specific. There is a couple other spots.
Yeah, so we have our New York City walking tour, but the pandemic was sort of pros and cons, I think, for a lot of businesses. But one of the great things that came about for COVID for us was this idea of virtual engagement. And what that meant for a business, especially as our mission was to help increase access to LGBTQ history, people didn't have to travel all the way, across the country or across the world to come learn about this history in Greenwich Village. It meant that I could give a Zoom presentation to thousands of people at a college or a university or a corporate organization and share a little bit more about that history. Since COVID, has sort of died down a little bit and we're back out in the world, that also has allowed me to now travel and do some speaking engagements all across the country. Again, sharing that mission, sharing the stories of LGBTQ folks that have paved the way before us. So our tour is centric to New York City, but the work that we do really does expand outwards.
So I want to acknowledge that it's really important that we recognize that there's so many different types of entrepreneurship in the world. And even though a lot of the focus tends to be on like big tech and big business and building a big business, it's really important to recognize that entrepreneurship can be on many different levels. And most entrepreneurship is on the level where it's not about scaling massively and growing huge. It's about consistency and showing up and supporting the people who do work with you and work for you. And that can be just as successful as any business. And so now, knowing that it isn't a big startup tech type business, can you talk about how you structured your business model for both impact and sustainability?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Callan, because in the initial stages of Christopher Street Tours, I think I was thinking about it from like more of a big tech startup perspective. My background was in corporate America, in tech specifically. So my brain was sort of wired in that, I'm going to grow all across the world and have LGBTQ tours in every major city and thinking about it from that kind of perspective. But as it went on, it became clear to me that I really just needed to focus on our mission and our purpose and what we wanted to do. And yes, there is LGBT history all over the country and all over the world. And you could have an LGBT tour in every city, but that wasn't necessarily what Christopher Street Tours was. We're named Christopher Street after Christopher Street in New York City, where the Stonewall Inn lives. So New York is kind of a third character here. It's like pretty central to the work that we do. So I think when we think about impact and how do we make that sustainable, I think it's talking about what are the products that we're offering. It's not necessarily growing up or growing out, but I think for me, it was more kind of digging deeper into what can we offer in New York City and really diversifying our product and our market in that kind of way. So a good example, when I first named my business, it was just Christopher Street Tours. And on the website, everything was about tours. But now I've kind of expanded to say tours and experiences, because not only do we offer walking tours, but we can do curated experiences. We can do queer weekend trips in the city, or whatever else folks are kind of looking for. So I think because of that, the impact has been able to grow a lot more just outside of walking tours. But then that also helps me create a sustainable business model because there's a little bit more to work with than just quote unquote, just a walking tour.
So I want to expand a little bit on the diversification of your revenue streams that you just talked about. Um, can you spread out and tell us more about what those options are and what they look like and how you've noticed? what's working and what's positively adding to the bottom line. And then maybe some experiences afterwards will go into what ended up not working. You go, okay, that maybe wasn't a good expansion. So let's talk about those diversifications and how you did grow in a good, sustainable way into those different spheres.
Yeah, and if it's okay with you, Callan, maybe I can start with like the not great ways.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll start there
Uh,
and then we'll end on the great.
okay, yeah, only because it was because of not great expansions. And I say not great, but maybe not as profitable. It was great. It just wasn't as profitable, you know? But that's what sort of led me to then think about other ways that Christopher Street Tours could grow. And that's really where we landed. So initially, when I was thinking about growth and diversification of revenue streams, I was thinking tours in every major city. And coincidentally, it came about one of my tour guides who was in New York was moving to the Boston area. And I said, hey, maybe you could create an LGBT tour in Boston and we could start expanding that way. And around the same time, there was a woman who gives LGBTQ tours in a different city. So I was like talking to her about maybe buying that business and, you know, slowly kind of expanding the reach of like all these LGBTQ tours. And sort of to my surprise, initially, no one was booking the Boston tour. No one was interested, it seemed. You know, of course, there were people that would reach out, and we had a couple bookings here and there, but it was certainly nothing like the profit in New York City. And upon further reflection, I sort of realized, you know, when you think about, at least in the United States or on the East Coast, queer history or LGBT activism, New York is the city that comes to mind. And of course, that exists in other places, but if you have a group of tourists or friends or whoever that are going to a destination and something on that list is going to be an LGBTQ walking tour, it's going to be New York City. So, because of those quote unquote failed attempts or less profitable kind of attempts to go into other cities, I said, well, what can we do in New York? Like, there's so much potential here outside of a walking tour that people are really hoping to get. And where that came for me was kind of thinking about my business from the perspective of different audiences. So for Christopher Street Tours, is it a gay business? Is it a tourism business? Is it a gay tourism business? Like, where do these sort of audiences intersect and who am I trying to reach? And it's kind of all of the above. You know, when we think about marketing and strategy, we want to reach queer folks, but we also want to reach tourists. And our sweet spot, of course, is queer tourists, you know, they're visiting the city. So in thinking about what queer folks and tourists are looking for, a tour is great. But after doing these tours for 6 years, I realized I have a lot of connections in the community, you know, people that own the Stonewall Inn. And I'm able to work with them and say, hey, maybe we could do like a tour and a drink, or maybe we could do like a bar tour. And the Stonewall is kind of like the pinnacle stop on this tour. Even just friends, you know, or activists and colleagues that have become really close friends, where when people come to the city, it's great to hear it from me, but to maybe talk to someone who is actually there, you know, who has been an activist for decades. And in the tourism world, you know, talking about business and profit, people will pay for that. People will pay to have a drink at Stonewall because that's a premium experience. They'll pay to meet and greet with an LGBTQ activist who can share their experiences with them over the last 40 years living in New York City, because those aren't experiences that they can necessarily get at home or just on their own. So we started crafting these sort of really high-end, luxury, unique, tailored experiences that people can experience, for lack of a better word, when they come to New York City, where they can come on a tour, they can see the sights, but then if they want to dive a little bit deeper, then we offer all of those options as well.
Like the full experience. I love that you do that. The most memorable tour that I've ever gone on, I lived in London in the UK for a while, and I went on a Jack the Ripper tour, and
Oh,
they
fun.
had actually had subtle actors implemented into the scenery. And so when they were talking about something, you saw somebody dressed up in a certain way walking down an alley or doing a thing, and you were like, wait, hold on. Like, am I tripping? Or is like that? And they weren't obvious enough to be like, oh, that's an actor part of this whole thing, but it
Yep.
added to the experience of all of it. And it's those little tiny things that make such a difference in an experience like this.
Mhm.
What about the diversification in terms of branching out and doing talks or adding talking on like the digital platform or having conversations maybe in corporate world or something like that?
Yeah, so that came about during COVID as well. So people were saying, hey, Michael, we did your tour, we loved it, we had a great time. Could you do a virtual tour during COVID? And it's hard to do a virtual tour. Like, it's not really, I don't want to say it's not as fun because there are some people that really have crafted that and are really skillful in delivering that. But I knew that wasn't something that was necessarily of interest to me. Like, I think the best part about a walking tour is being there physically in person and seeing the sights. So I didn't think a virtual tour was maybe the best offering that I could present. However, I kind of turned that to say, well, let me do maybe an hour long workshop or presentation or trivia event. Like I came up with all these different products that I could offer virtually. And that was sort of the start of like the Christopher Street Tour speaking engagements that kind of came to be. We worked with corporate organizations and schools and even libraries, like different community organizations that just wanted to have a little bit something educational for Pride. People, when they think of Pride, they think about celebrating and all the fun and the joy. And that's really important too, especially now, is like queer joy and having those moments, but also having the educational component too, and knowing why Pride even began in the first place, I think is also really important. So then as again, COVID's kind of slowly started to end and, quote unquote end, and people could go back out into the world, I started getting invited to different offices in different cities all around the country. Folks just want to learn more about this history and this activism. But it's always surprising to me when I talk about this and sort of the intentionality behind this sort of expansion, because I've never paid for an ad. Like, it wasn't this sort of like, now I'm going to be super intentional about being a key speaker. Folks just care about this, and when they Google queer activism or LGBT history, Christopher Street Tours just has a really good SEO, which I don't, I'm not going to even pretend like how I got that, but I'm really glad that we have it. And then we can continue to go out there and share the work that we're doing and share these stories of people that have paved the way. So it all just kind of happened very naturally. But now being in business, for 6+ years, I like to think that I'm a little bit more intentional about how I'm reaching out to potential clients for speaking gigs and other opportunities.
Yeah, that makes me really happy. I'm like my background is in SEO, so so it makes me
There you
happy
go.
that like you've got that going on because that is an important part. And that kind of leads perfectly into this next question because you did mention ads, like you've never spent on ads. Like how do you market your business effectively? Because, what are some of those key strategies you've used to grow your audience? In today's world, it's all about like attention economy and how do you get that? And there's so many times that you'll hear somebody say like, oh, I wish I'd known about this when I went to such and such, or I wish I'd known, because unless you're that type of person who naturally wants to like, oh, I'll go on a walking tour or I'll do a thing, how do you get in front of people to broaden that audience to market yourself without having to pay for ads or without having like coming across as like pushy or whatever?
Yeah, that's so funny that you asked that. I think it's really thinking about your business and what makes sense. There's not, I don't think, like a blanket strategy for marketing for everybody, which, I've talked to some marketing agencies and you can tell the ones that really take the time to like get to know you and know your business and know what works versus the ones that are like, this is just the strategy that we do with everyone. And for me, I've always sort of leaned on the more like brand forward strategy and like story forward strategy. And for me, I could say my business relies on storytelling. Like that's what we do. Like that's my job, is to be a professional storyteller, sharing queer stories of, people from the past however many decades, whether it's a speaking gig or a tour or these experiences, like all of it sort of falls under storytelling. So thinking about like a paid ad, for example, I don't have experience doing this. So, it could bring me billions of dollars. I'm not sure. But when I think about like a static photo, let's say on like a social media campaign, it would have to be a really good photo to be able to tell a story, like the story that I want to tell. So instead, I actually found that TikTok is an incredible marketing strategy for us, and not the TikToks that are like, hey, I'm Michael, I give gay tours in New York, book my tour. like those TikToks never do well. Even though, maybe intuitively, like you think that's what you should be doing. But what I found works is like giving people a snippet of what I do on my tour or for my speaking engagements, which is just telling stories. Like, hey, everyone, I was walking around the Greenwich Village today and I saw this Progress Pride flag. And these are the components of the flag, and these are what the colors means, and this is what it is. Now that you have all that information, if you want to learn more, join us on a tour or check out our website. It's like they're already in because they're so engaged with what I'm saying. And then you just kind of like drop it at the end and people are like, oh, okay, cool. That's a cool way to learn more. But it's the stories. It's like being story forward. And I think honestly that trickles into everything. Like social media, we try and do that too, or we kind of lead with social media. But even just like our website, like the photos that we have on our website and like the language that we put, like we really want to make sure that our brand is forward and our purpose is forward. We're not quote unquote just a walking tour, is what I like to say. It really has a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose, and people purchase because of that. Like they feel an emotional connection. And I think that's really important when we're talking about marketing and strategy and how to sort of put your business out there and what people see. What's the public vision
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna say that like that makes 100% sense to me with what you do. Leading with story, people connect with humans, like other humans connect with other humans, and story is how we've connected throughout our whole entire history, right? Like before written language, there was spoken language, and it was done through story. And so, leading, especially on a platform like TikTok, where it's very my experience of TikTok is I only like to engage with the very personable, like I'm a human being right here. Like this is very raw, organic. Like that is the energy. And so when you come across that and you're telling that in your stories on your TikTok or your social, where it's like leading with the story of like this is a piece of education or a piece of history, people like to learn, and if they're learning, then you will stay top of mind for like, oh well, if I ever go to New York, I'd love to do a full tour and like get this whole experience, and then that gets shared with other people because it's about leading with value and leading with that story. And it's the same that I try and teach clients about with SEO. There's so many people who try and like fast track it and like skip ahead and like don't want to put in the work, but if you're providing a blog post or an article and you're leading with true value and true story, it's not about just the information. It's about how are they getting to that information. And some would argue like, oh, they don't have the attention span. I was like, yes, but the right people will
Mm.
have the attention span because if they're invested enough for that, they're invested enough to also then give you their money. And that at the end of the day is the important part in the business aspect of it all. So that, it totally makes sense with what you're doing. As somebody who combines activism and business, how do you make sure that your activism leads to tangible outcomes within the business, especially in today's world with what is going on down in the US and around the world as a whole?
Mm.
I think this is a really important question and a really important aspect that it's happening, but also you can measure those things and see them tangibly because then being able to share that back and be like, no, this is actual evidence that this changed this thing or helped over here. Do you have any of that that you can share with us?
I think after giving these tours for this many years, I think the thing that queer history has taught me is there's no one right way to be an activist. There's 100 stories that I could tell you of 100 people that have changed the world, and we might not even know their names, and they all did something different. I think traditionally we think of activism as thousands of people marching in the streets, with their fists up in the air and holding protest signs. And that is activism, and that's really important. But how I started to reframe what it meant to be an activist, and specifically as a business person, was I was telling these stories all around my tour. And there was some of that, but it was more just like, well, this person had a special skill and they wanted to see a change in the world, and then they did this thing, and then they changed the world. Like, I could tell you a couple examples maybe, but Larry Kramer, for example, was kind of infamously known as like this angry man, but was a writer and who started ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power. there's this iconic clip of him during the height or the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, like shouting out about AIDS as a plague, and nobody's really doing anything about it. But he wasn't an quote unquote activist at that time. He was a writer. So what he did was he used his voice, both literally, but also in the written word, to educate people around AIDS and around safe sex practices and things that generally people didn't really want to hear at that time. But he made sure that it was really important. And he did that. And that, I think, is activism, even if it wasn't necessarily, chanting in the streets. How I think our tours are activism and sort of how that relates to business. I think the biggest way to be an activist or an advocate is just living your true authentic self. Like that is such an act of resistance and resilience in a world, like you said, but in the United States, but really in the world where queerness is being erased and queer joy is being attempted to be taken away from us. What's like the coolest thing to do in that case is stand out in a group of fully open queer people learning about queer history, people that have paved the way, and then inspiring and empowering people on how they can continue the way forward in this time. And I think a big part of that is like, listen, this is not new. Like we as a queer community, we've been there, we've done that. Like we've faced terrible leadership, oppressive governments in the past, and this is how people have rose up against that, and this is how we can do it today. So it sounds kind of frou-frou maybe, or like woo-woo a little bit, of like inspiring people and empowering people to create positive social change, but it really is that. And I think in a tangible way, I always ask people at the end of the tour, like, remember one story that you took away and then share that with everybody that you know. And what we're doing is we're uplifting queer voices and sharing those stories. And the more that exists in the world, I think the harder it will be to continue this sort of oppressive regime, because people are familiar then with queer folks, with queer stories. And that's just my sort of like personal philosophy. I also think the last thing I'll say on this is that I always encourage my tour guides to talk openly about whatever they want, like politics, the government, where we are in the world. And I think that openness is what encourages people to come back on our tours. And I don't have any like specific data on that in terms of like if this person came back to this tour because of this reason. But I have gotten qualitative feedback in the past of like, this is the only place where I felt like I could actively engage in these sort of conversations with other queer people like me. Because, maybe in New York or certain parts, we're used to that. Like we live in kind of a bubble, if you will, of like queerness. But if people are coming from other countries where being queer is still criminalized and still technically illegal, and then they come to New York City and engage in that conversation, to me, just that community, just that connection is a form of activism in itself, because it shows queer resistance and queer joy. And I think that work is really important.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think that just the act of being yourself openly is activism. It has been. Hopefully, it won't have to be the case into the future. I'm very, very hopeful of Gen Z. They're one of the queerest generations, and like absolutely adore them and love them. And I think that that was only because our generations and generations before us were the ones who were leaders and spearheading and being themselves. And that activism, even though the quote unquote energy of the activism maybe feels less than the active activism that has happened in the past, by us still being ourselves loudly and proudly opens the door for everybody else to see us and say, okay, I see another person. Because I remember growing up, I just turned 38, and like there was like Ellen DeGeneres and
Yeah.
like a couple other folks, and then Will and Grace came along, but it was so only allowed to be in this specific type or in this specific way. And now there's so many possibilities out there, and I can see a correlation between that visibility and the queerness of Gen Z. And not saying that they all have to be queer, but they're just so much more open to it and being like, yeah, like do whatever you want, be whoever you want to be. And talking about politics, a little bit of why I think we're seeing what we're seeing now is because the older generation that didn't have that is clinging on to the way they want it to be because they don't want change and they fear change.
Mm.
And they're terrified of the younger generation that's just like, why are you holding on so desperately to these things? Like, can we just let it go and move on? And it's these two extreme dynamics, which is wild, which I think also came about from technology. But yeah, wholeheartedly agree that just being yourself and sharing those stories allows other people around you to be like, even if they don't say anything, even if, whatever, it's not mentioned, but that maybe closeted person who's sitting there going like, okay, I at least feel safer in this space. And then being able to talk and having your folks on your tours actively talk and engage um, with people who come. I really love that because so many tours is like you stand and listen. There's no engagement, but the more engagement you have, that engagement is what creates the energy of community. And by creating that, you empower people to learn and grow from themselves and not just be spoken at. And so I think that that's a really, really important aspect of the work that you're doing.
Totally. Thank you so much. And, I will say, kind of on that note, we do give youth specific tours. So it's tailored a little bit towards, middle school and high school students where it is more engaging. There's more questions. It's more community building and it's shorter just because, their attention span is a little less. But why we give those tours and why I say that is because I've seen sort of the wide range of young LGBTQ people of this next generation, or I should just say young people in general, because, sometimes we'll have GSA groups of like sixth graders, which, I mean, I came out a little bit later. I was 19 when I came out, but like the fact that there are groups of sixth graders that have, pronoun pins and their flags and they're out walking about in New York City and just so openly queer is so amazing to me. But at the same time, we also give tours to people that visit New York City from all over the United States. And there might not be that kind of open queerness and that rainbow flag. And the best thing that I can do is kind of just show them, even in that short amount of time, that it is okay to be your true authentic self. Like even through my own example, the rainbows I wear or the stories that I'm telling in history, like history is a form of representation. Like we can look at history and see ourselves represented through these like incredible stories and activists and know that we're not alone. I will never know the full impact that Christopher Street Tours has, but my hope is that even if one closeted young person can see our tour or see someone represented in history where they say, maybe it is okay to be myself, then I think it's all worth it. So that's where I'll end on
Yeah.
that.
And it just goes to show you don't need to have this massive tech company or this massive behemoth, whatever, to make an impact in the world and to share that. Wrapping things off, I probably shouldn't have wrapped things off with this specific question, but in the current climate we are in, it's very relevant in today's world. Politically, things are very tenuous to say the least. Are there any steps that you're taking to protect your business? Or do you have any advice for other maybe small business owners or folks who are in the same kind of world that you're in that they can take to protect their business?
It's a really good question, and a sad question, honestly, that we're like talking about this, but I appreciate it because we have to be talking about this. I think we're living in reality and these are important conversations to have. So I think first and foremost, I will acknowledge that I'm very lucky to be living in New York City, which regardless of what happens on, a national level, I think if certain laws are changed or, accommodations or protections are taken away, I can't imagine a world where New York City would be impacted by that or New York State. However, you never know. So I think it's always good to be thinking about those things. Um, this makes me think when I talk to school groups, a lot of teachers kind of come in and they want the message of like, it's okay to come out. And, they want me to share that message, like come out and live your true authentic self. And I always need to sort of add a caveat that like, yes, if you feel comfortable and safe and ready to do so, like I don't want to be responsible for someone's discomfort or even worse, feeling unsafe because they came out in the world. And maybe it's similar for a business sense. I wish that I could say, continue to operate your gay owned business and do whatever that you need to do. But if it becomes unsafe to do that, that's a really interesting point, a turning point of like, well, then what do you do in that case? I can give you a real example, not with Christopher Street Tours, but before my tech stint, I used to work in higher education. And a lot of colleges and universities have sort of been pivoting because there was an executive order taking away diversity, education, and inclusion. Uh, we could talk about that a whole other episode, but there's a lot of colleges that have DEI departments or are doing DEI work, and the thought is like, not we're going to have to get rid of this completely, but it's how do we pivot to still do important work that revolves around this, and maybe we just don't call it DEI. So I know certain colleges have already sort of changed that wording and that language to the Office of Excellence, and they're just calling it that because it is excellent, but they can't technically call it DEI. So I think a lot of this, unfortunately, is just semantics. And I say that to say, like, I don't want to diminish the real impact that has on queer people. However, I think in the case of like DEI programs, it's just kind of thinking about how do you pivot to still do really important work. For me, I have thought about this personally, and I think instead of like gay, like queer tours, we would have to pivot if we had to, right? But maybe it's just social justice themed tours, and of course, there's still a rainbow. Like people know what it is, but it's just thinking about how we can continue to do the work under the constraints and the restraints that may or may not be put in place. I think my advice is to always have a backup plan and to always just be thinking about what that pivot could be. I think that's just good business sense anyway, like regardless of the situation, regardless of who's in office. But on the note I was talking about before about how history, there's sort of a visibility and representation in history. Queer people have never existed in a time where they were 100% completely free or lived under a government that was not repressive or oppressive in some kind of way. Like, this is not new. I think it's new for a lot of us. I think this iteration of how we're seeing this is new, but the idea of the criminalization or discrimination towards queer people and other groups we've seen before. So seeing that in history, learning from that, and then thinking how to make our own pivots, what makes sense for us personally as queer people, but also as businesses and queer-owned businesses, I think is the next best step.
And I will add to this because there are like actual physical things you can do. And for me, that is being in community and specifically the like organizations like the CGLCC, Canada's LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, the NGLCC, which is the National LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce down in the US, organizations like Start Out, get involved with these queer business structures, even if necessarily you don't buy in or all this other kind of stuff, it still provides you with links and connections to other people doing the same work in business, in other things. We need more than ever to come together and to support each other. And that's just one way you can be plugged into a support system so you don't feel like you're a little island. Entrepreneurship, we kind of sometimes can feel like these little islands floating off by ourselves. And the more you can kind of plug into these structures, you feel like not as alone while you're going through this because other people will say, oh, I'm going through it too. Maybe they have, community meetups or online meetups, and then people can share their struggles and be like, oh, I'm feeling the same, or I've gone through the same. This is how I overcame it, or this is what I found out you can do to kind of overcome or work through and all that. And so I think that that's a real tangible piece that people can do in order to do that kind of stuff. This has been a fantastic conversation. I could talk for hours. I am a giant queer history buff. Like I think it is so important that we tell our history and like who is it, like the Book of Queer and like all those things that like these things are so important for us to be louder and louder and louder because we are making progress and we know we're making progress because we're being yelled at louder than we've ever been yelled at before. And that tells me something is that they're scared. And this is the last dying gasp to hold on to that power because they can see us coming. So with that, where can folks find out about Christopher Street Tours, find out more about you, booking tours, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, thank you. Everything is on our website, christopherstreettours.com. We're on most of the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Christopher Street Tours if you want to follow along our storytelling journey, and that's where you can find us.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for being a guest, Michael.
Thank you so much. It was great chatting with you, Callan. I appreciate it.